Hello. Well, we're into the second half of January, and for many of us that would usually mean it's time to start thinking about holidays. Not that I'd be going on holiday yet, but by now I start to look forward to getting away in a couple of months' time. But not this year. Any possibility of getting away somewhere warm still seems to be a very long way off. Of course, one of the challenges when we do finally get away is packing. Especially if we're travelling light, things go into the suitcase, then get taken out again as I decide what it is that I really need to take and what I can do without. What do I really need when going on a journey? Last week we thought about Psalm 120, the first of the Psalms of Ascent, those songs which pilgrims used as they made their way to Jerusalem. For them, the journey could be long and hard. So what was it that they really needed? That's the question which the next of our Psalms helps us to answer. That well-known and much-loved Psalm 121. Let me read it now. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. So our pilgrims had set out on this journey to Jerusalem, probably for one of the great festivals. They'd set out on this pilgrimage, but for some of them it would be a long and potentially hazardous journey. There was always the risk of bandits or wild animals, as well as the heat and the rough tracks. And as you go along, there are mountains all around. Most of you will know that I love walking in the mountains. There's something about that towering, majestic scenery which draws me. But 3,000 years ago, these pilgrims probably wouldn't have been thinking so much about the scenery when he looked up to the mountains around. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? During the time these psalms were probably written, there was still pagan worship going on in Israel, despite the fact that time and time again the Lord had said, "You must have no God but me." Shrines were set up to gods with names like Baal, Ashtoreth, Shemosh. These shrines were usually set on hilltops. They were called the high places. Many Israelites would go to these high places to worship what were false gods, because they believed that these so-called gods could help them. There were fertility gods who would ensure their crops would grow. There were regional gods who would keep them safe as they passed through an area. And yes, it sounds as though these people had completely abandoned the true God, but that wasn't how they saw it. All the time these high places were being used, worship was still going on in the temple. These people seemed to have had some kind of blind spot which allowed them to worship the Lord in the temple, say that they trusted the Lord, but actually in specific areas they trusted other gods. But this pilgrim wasn't so foolish. He wasn't taken in by the futility of such pathetic pseudo-gods. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. For all the impressiveness of the hilltop shrines and the rituals which went on there, they were nothing compared to the Lord. There is only one God, only one Lord. Everything else is a delusion, giving the appearance of being able to help, but ultimately absolutely worthless. And so the pilgrim goes on his way, and the rest of the psalm is a wonderful expression of God's protection for his people. In verse 3, he will not let your foot slip. In verse 6, the sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. In verse 7, the Lord will keep you from all harm. Isn't that wonderful? Except, I have a sneaking suspicion that sometimes one of God's people did slip and twist their ankle, or get sunstroke. For us, at the moment, grieving the deaths of Pauline Williams and Joan Edwards, two women who knew and trusted the Lord, how can the psalm say things like, the Lord will keep you from all harm? And I think it's because this psalm is focusing on what is really important, the life of faith. These songs of ascent may be set in the context of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but they're using that as a picture of the pilgrimage of faith, a life lived journeying with God as one of his people. And so here in Psalm 121, the focus isn't on literal journeys, where you might twist your ankle, but on that journey of discipleship. You see, if you were on a pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, twisting your ankle or suffering from sunstroke could mean the end of your pilgrimage. You'd never arrive. But the promise of this psalm is that that won't happen on your pilgrimage to heaven. Eugene Peterson puts it like this: the promise of the psalm is not that we shall never stub our toes, but that no injury, no illness, no accident, no distress will have evil power over us. That is, will be able to separate us from God's purposes in us. If you look through the psalm, you'll see that one phrase recurs. In verse 3, he who watches over you. In verse 5, the Lord watches over you. In verse 7, he will watch over your life. In verse 8, the Lord will watch over you. Do you get the message? If you're a Christian, the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, is watching over you every moment. And that doesn't mean that you will be spared from life's problems and pains and suffering. But all of the time, he is there, keeping you from evil, keeping your foot from slipping off the path. Suffering doesn't mean that God has forgotten you. God's purpose is for you to know him and walk with him in this life. And his big concern for you is to bring you to the end of this pilgrimage to spend eternity with him. That's what he's done for Pauline and for Joan. That's what he will do for you. And compared to that, all these false gods were really pathetic and worthless. They offered a sort of benefit in the here and now, but nothing for eternity. And actually what they offered in the here and now was just an illusion. And it's just the same today. The gods that people have today are different. But the message of Psalm 121 is, forget these feeble imitation gods. The Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, watches over you. Why waste your passion on worthless idols? Only the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, cares for us, has saved us, and watches over us. And if you have set out on this journey of discipleship with him, he has promised to keep you. Not to keep you from the problems, but to keep you through them. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. On the journey through life, there is only one thing that ultimately you need. So please, don't be fooled by imitations.